As Donald Trump prepares for his return to the White House, so does Canada. It's a reality this government has lived before, staring down the possibility of tariffs, an influx of asylum seekers, defense spending pressure, and anything else Trump might have up his sleeve. Trudeau revived his Committee on Canada-U.S. Relations, made up of high-ranking cabinet ministers, ready to take on Trump 2.0. But are there lessons learned from Trump's last administration? Gerry Butts was Justin Trudeau's principal secretary from 2015 to 2019. He is now the vice chairman of the Eurasia Group. Gerry Butts, good to see you again. Thanks for coming in.
Good to be here, David. Thanks for having me.
You were right there in the middle of Trump 1.0. What's the biggest takeaway you have from that experience that you think the government could apply to the return?
Yeah, well, stay calm is the most important thing, right? That it can, as it looks to your viewers at home, it can be a circus atmosphere, but you have to keep your own presence of mind and realize you're there to do really important jobs to represent the national interest and keep that in mind at all times.
How different do you think he is now compared to 8 years ago? There's a different cast of characters around him. He's older. Yeah. He's been through a lot more. How do you think he's going to approach things this time?
Well, I think he's a more dangerous character in some ways for Canada and for his allies because he's got the 4 years of experience of governing, and he's been elected with a much broader mandate than he was in 2016. There were lots of people who could comfort themselves by saying he kind of drew an inside straight in 2016, that it was a fluke, and his losing in 2020 seemed to confirm that for a lot of people. But in this case, there's just no mistaking the depth and breadth of his mandate. So he's going to come to office this time emboldened, believing that he has a very deep democratic mandate to do exactly many of the things he tried to do in the first mandate.
I know in the first mandate, you were able to work with people around him who would have been more establishment and traditional Republicans, who might have restrained some of his wilder impulses
like
back
Steve
then.
Bannon?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, who's conveniently available for work.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean.
I know exactly.
And a lot of those people, they're gone. In fact, they're on the other side. They campaigned against him in a lot of cases. It's a different group around him now, plus the Senate, plus likely the House, plus the Supreme Court. I mean, how do you begin to approach that when it's a whole new cast of characters from up here in Canada?
Well, if the reports are right, David, then at least Bob Lighthizer is still around, and I would take a lot of not comfort from that, because Bob's a really tough negotiator, and he certainly got his national interest at heart in the forefront of his mind at all times. But he's a professional and someone you can rely on to keep their word and to do business like a professional. So I think if the Financial Times is right, then the once and future U.S. trade representative, then I think there's someone at least on the other side of the table we can do business with. Your point about the Supreme Court, though, and Congress, and the types of people that he campaigned to get nominated to for senatorial positions and for Congress, that's a different story, right? It makes the point I was just trying to make, that he's now coming in emboldened. He feels like he's got a much bigger mandate, and he feels like he's campaigned very transparently on the things that he wanted to do. If you look at the Trump 2016 campaign, what concerned us at the time, and rightly so as it turned out, was the disproportionate weight he put on renegotiating the NAFTA agreement.
Right.
This time, it's a much broader mandate, right? It's tariffs, it's mass deportations. These are things that could cause an inflationary environment, for instance, which would be ironic if it was indeed inflation that elected him in the first place.
Well, it's the tariffs, and it's still unclear at this point whether Canada is affected by that, Mexico, whether the old NAFTA partners are carved out or not. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. The mass deportation, the threat of that could send people fleeing to the northern border, right? You know, people from Haitians, for example, with temporary protected status. I mean, how do you even begin to prepare for that kind of disruption in the Canadian government?
Well, you have to have contingency plans, and you also have to be a bit stoic about it, that there are certain things that you're never going to be able to talk the President of the United States out of doing. And if the President of the United States happens to be Donald Trump, and he firmly believes that he's just been given a popular mandate to do precisely what he said he was going to do on the campaign trail, then you've got to prepare to deal with the fallout and the consequences, and not, you can be hopeful that he will moderate his views once he walks into the Oval Office for the second time, but I think that's not borne out by history. So you have to build the contingency plans in place.
It's going to be tough for a progressive-leaning Liberal government in Canada to align with the Trump administration on values. It seems you got to go hard on value, just straight dollars and cents arguments about the consequence of trade disruption pointing to key states and these sorts of things, because NAFTA will come up for renewal in 2026. Who knows where the tariff things are going to go? You got to start hitting, what, state houses, governors, you know?
State houses, governors, you know, you have to knock on a lot of doors, figuratively and literally, in the United States to get your point across. I think, though, for your viewers, one thing I could say that they can take comfort from is that Canada is not at the top of the list of agenda items for Donald Trump. That, as an associate in New York said to me, well, I'd much rather be you guys than the Mexicans. And that's cold comfort, but it is some comfort. And Canada has the most productive bilateral trading relationship with the United States. It's one that's generally seen to be fair and to be productive on both sides. So there's a lot of positives there are a lot of positives to lean in on, David, but you know, we should be hoping the eye of Sauron is pointing elsewhere for
yes.
our sakes.
Yeah, get your fellowship and sneak in and get the job done. But that is the challenge of advocating for and standing up for Canadian interests without drawing the bullseye on you, right? So like getting the attention of the administration to the point that you can make progress on tariff and trade without, well, upsetting things and making it worse.
Yeah, and I think, look, Donald Trump called the USMCA the best deal ever made, right? I'm sure they will revise their views of that as the deadline approaches in 2026, as you said. But we spent a lot of time negotiating that agreement with them, and they agreed to it. So I think it's important that Canadians realize that we have a lot to build on.
So since leaving politics, you're now with the Eurasia Group. And one of the first interviews we did at the start of this year was with Ian Bremmer, who talked about, your colleague Ian Bremmer, about the number one geopolitical risk in your group's assessment was U.S. domestic politics. And I think this was the outcome that Ian Bremmer was worried about. I know Europe is very anxious. Ukraine is very anxious. There's a lot of uncertainty in the Middle East about what this could mean. How do you see this potentially playing out in all of those spheres? Yeah,
well, look, I mean, we've been around for 28 years at Eurasia Group. 2 out of the last 3, I think maybe even 3 of the last 4 of our top risks report, which comes out every January. It was the first time that a U.S. domestic political risk had ever been the top risk in the world. We're used to, everybody in the West especially, is accustomed to the U.S. being a shock absorber, right, for geopolitical risk. We're now firmly in an age where they are an exporter of geopolitical risk. They are a destabilizing force rather than a stabilizing force. And everybody who does business with the U.S. from either an economic or security perspective, which, by the way, means just about everybody in the world, has to be fully cognizant of that. So while the outcome we were really worried about was an uncertain or contested election that created violence in the streets, and that outcome didn't materialize, this would be up there.
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats are not going to January 6th anything, right? They've accepted this and they've moved on, and you know, it's amazing how voter fraud went away in one cycle.
It's quite amusing to think about, actually, what a Democratic January 6th looks like.
Yeah, well, but I go back to Trump's first presidency, and Vladimir Zelensky came into the consciousness of a lot of people because he was trying to leverage him for dirt on Hunter Biden. Now Vladimir Zelensky is a wartime president relying heavily on the United States. And I look at that particular issue with Trump and what he said about Ukraine and the belief in a lot of his circles that it's a grift, you know, and that people are getting rich off the war. I mean, where do you potentially see that one going?
Well, I think that's the first thing we should be worried about, both as steadfast allies of Ukraine, as all parties of all political stripes are in this country, and as millions and millions of Canadians are. I think in some ways Vladimir Zelensky is probably the unluckiest man in the world because of the outcome of this election, and we'll all be waiting with bated breath to see if the worst of our concerns about Trump's attachment to the war materializes. So I think, first of all, the Europeans are going to bear the brunt of this without question. And what we'll be looking for at Eurasia Group is what kind of ad hoc arrangements are made in Europe to try in some way to compensate for what will probably be a diminished American commitment to the war. So this isn't over yet, and I wouldn't be popping the champagne corks in Moscow if I were Vladimir Putin yet. The Europeans remain pretty committed, but that cohesion, which was only found in the face of Russian aggression, it remains to be seen whether it's durable. So that's something we're watching really closely at Eurasia Group.
Just one last question. I mean, you've worked in politics a long time, obviously for liberal, progressive political parties. What lesson, what message do you take from what we saw in the United States with this massive shift to the right across all cohorts, pretty much all moving towards Donald Trump and abandoning a lot of progressive candidates?
Yeah, well, when I was in politics, David, I used to say the main thing is to keep the main thing, and the main thing is to be a party that represents the interests of regular people. And I think that the Democrats are far afield from that right now, and they're kind of paying the price of it. That said, there's a lot of entrails, a lot of time to be spent looking at the entrails of this one, and we should caution drawing too broad a conclusion from one election result. I think it's pretty clear that inflation has been the grim reaper for incumbents all over the world, something we called a couple of years ago at Eurasia Group, by the way, said it would happen. And it didn't matter whether you were a social democrat in Finland, a Tory in Britain, whatever Bolsonaro was in Brazil, or the Democratic incumbent in the United States. Everybody's been mowed down by this economic environment.
Gerry Butts, former Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister, now the Vice Chairman of the Eurasia Group. Thanks for coming in, sir.
Great to be here.